their names. You've never seen their faces. Garbo, Tricycle, Treasure, Brutus, and Bronx. British spies during the Second World War. Their mission: deceive Adolf Hitler to ensure the success of the D-Day landings in Normandy.
The double agents, the wireless deception, the false information fed to foreign diplomats. This was brilliantly handled.
A life in the shadows that transformed these 5 agents into masters of deception.
His case officer thought he was the best actor in the world.
I never like to give my opinion unless I have strong reasons to justify my assurances.
This is the classified story of 3 men and 2 women you've never heard of, who changed the course of history. Throughout the Second World War, Hitler's Germany continued to extend its influence. Prague, Paris, Copenhagen. Europe's big cities fall one by one under the yoke of the Nazi army. By November 1943, the Third Reich and its Führer reigned supreme over 15 countries. Britain, the United States, and Canada joined forces to liberate occupied Europe. They launched the Operation Overlord. Its goal: to land thousands of soldiers on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944 and push the Nazi army to the borders of Germany. It's risky. The enemy has been expecting a major attack somewhere along the Atlantic coast. And victory isn't assured against the powerful Reich army.
The SS Panzer divisions, I would say, were among the greatest fighting formations that the world has ever seen. And they had these brilliant tanks. Of course, the Allies had many more tanks, but the German Tigers and Panther tanks were superb. The German army, as an institution, I would say, was much better than the British and the Americans.
So how does one deal with the powerful army of the Third Reich? How do the Allies ensure a successful landing in Normandy?
In wartime, truth is so precious that it should be attended by a bodyguard of lies.
A bodyguard of lies. When he pronounces these words on December 1st, 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill has a very specific plan. Hitler must be tricked.
Winston Churchill especially, but also many of the Allied commanders knew that if the Germans in the West were able to deploy their full strength in the first 24 or 48 hours after the invasion, they could well have thrown the Allies back into the sea. But if they could distract, divert, slow the Germans, then the operation could succeed.
Churchill wanted surprise. That was the only way in which the invasion was going to be a success.
The HM Treasury is one of many official buildings in London. In its basement, a bunker, built discreetly in 1938, the War Cabinet. Here, in 1943, the biggest deception campaign in military history is conceived. Operation Bodyguard. At the head of the mission, the London Controlling Section, an ultra-secret organization of high-ranking Army and Secret Service personnel. They craft a crazy plan to make Hitler believe that several landings will take place at the end of the summer of '44. In Calais, in Norway, in the southwest of France, and in the Mediterranean, everywhere except the actual place of the landing, Normandy. To give substance to the plan, the Allies create a phantom army, the first US Army Group, or FUSAG, stationed in the southeast of England. At its head, a true general, George S. Patton, well known by the Germans for his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily.
The Germans expected him to play a major role in the landings, so publicly it was announced that he was going to command the 1st United States Army Group. And the components of the 1st United States Army Group were deployed in exactly where the Germans expected to see them, in the southeast of England, in anticipation of embarking for the Pas-de-Calais.
The English film studios perfect the illusion of FUSAG. They create dozens of inflatable tanks and wooden boats, truer-than-life decoys deployed to the southeast of England.
The deception plan was based on what the Germans were predisposed to believe. So, in anticipation of an invasion of the Pas-de-Calais, you would expect a concentration of troops in the southeast of England. How do you accomplish that? There were reports in the newspapers of fights amongst American troops arguing over women in pubs and hotels in the southeast of England. It actually never happened, but these were reports that were put into the newspapers.
With the first part of the lie in place, the misinformation campaign expands. That duty falls to another ultra-secretive organization, the 20 Committee, or Double Cross. Led by Sir John Cecil Masterman, it brings together representatives of the London Controlling Section, British Secret Services, and Allied armies. Its mission: using a network of double agents to mislead intelligence services of the Reich. These spies, who gained the confidence of the Germans, actually worked for the Allies. Among them, 3 men and 2 women play a crucial role in Operation Bodyguard. Their code names: Tricycle, Bronx, Brutus, Garbo, and Treasure.
Double Cross was by far the most important deception operation of the war, and the agents involved in it were absolutely critical. Everybody knew that if D-Day failed, then all sorts of things were possible, whereas if D-Day succeeded and the Allies got ashore, then the war in the West was sooner or later decided.
The National Archives of Kew in the suburbs of London preserve all the details of this vast sham. Some top-secret documents, now declassified, reveal the crucial role these spies played in pulling off the largest military operation of the 20th century.
Dear Jorge, you are very right to think that I am an awful person to correspond with, but believe it or not, I could not find half an hour to write to you. I'm dropping you these few lines only to tell you that you should not worry so much about your sister. She regained her health completely, and nobody would believe that she was a very ill girl a few months ago.
In this seemingly harmless letter, a double agent discreetly sends a message to his German spy master. Between the lines, he writes another text in invisible ink, made of diluted aspirin.
Good spies, spies that want to live a long time, don't want to have any proprietary spycraft equipment with them. Their safety is that they simply look like a normal citizen. So if they could access common household chemicals, something they could buy from a pharmacy, then they could create an ink to use to communicate to their headquarters.
Invisible ink is simple to make. Revealing it takes more effort. The German intelligence services developed a complex two-step method. First, they coated the letter with a chemical solution and let it dry for at least an hour. Then, they coated the letter with another secret mix of chemicals. After the second solution dried, the message would slowly reveal itself.
The German loved this two-step formula. And the reason for this was that counterintelligence services, often in the postal system, developed broad techniques that they would use to test multiple letters. They would make a cocktail of various reagents, take a small brush, paint it across the face of the envelope to see if any hidden writing developed. But with a two-part system, it would never, ever expose the writing underneath.
This seemingly bland letter, written 8 months before D-Day, hides an invisible message revealed in the transcripts. It is one of thousands kept in the National Archives, pertaining to Operation Bodyguard. On the left, the cover letter. To the right, the secret writing.
I have too much material to send you by letter, and as nothing is extremely urgent, I will bring it with me in about 3 weeks.
The secret text is signed with the codename Ivan. For the British Secret Service, this is the double agent Tricycle. His real name, Duško Popov, a 30-year-old Serbian who studied law in Germany.
Duško Popov, I thought before the invention of James Bond that he was James Bond. He was suave, good-looking. He had this ability to seduce women. He was a great womanizer. He was a very amusing raconteur. He had a funny story for every occasion. He was a gambler, and he was a party goer, and a wonderful playboy, but really very good company and very entertaining. And you couldn't fail but adore Duško.
One would think that having high-profile activities, running around with women, partying, all of those things would increase the risk to an agent. If you're looking for an agent, you're looking generally for the little gray man or woman, somebody who floats below the surface, doesn't draw attention to themselves, and does the job. In Popov's case, of course, he wasn't that person. But interestingly, that sort of served him well, because I think the Germans, number one, they weren't very curious about it, but number two, had they been curious, they would have thought, okay, no reasonable intelligence service would ever accept a man like this as an agent.
Marko Popov is the son of the agent Tricycle. Today, he is the custodian of his father's archives and personal history.
Duško, after his studies in Belgrade, went to take his doctorate in Freiburg in Germany. And there he met a German of Danish origins called Johnny Jepsen. They both shared a nonchalant playboy style of life. Both had rich parents, enjoyed life, enjoyed whatever they could in those days. And both were so pro-freedom that they ostensibly showed their despise for the Hitlerian regime.
A few years later, Duško Popov learns that his friend Johnny is enlisted in the Abwehr, the German Secret Service, and wants to recruit him.
Duško and Johnny were a good tandem, and they already, without words, knew what they could expect of each other. So without saying it openly, it was clear from the start to Duško that Johnny could not have been working with the Abwehr intentionally, without some subterfuge.
Duško Popov is convinced that Johnny secretly intends to become a double agent and share German intelligence with the Allies. In following his friend's idea, Duško agrees to join the Abwehr. And in 1940, Popov starts working for MI5 and moves to London. The Germans suspect nothing. They have full confidence in the information he sends them. Undercover as a ministerial attaché for the Yugoslav government, Popov travels regularly to Portugal, where he meets Major Ludovico von Karstoff, his German case master.
He usually set up his meetings at the baccarat or roulette table in the casino in Estoril, and they would point by putting the dices on the numbers, the day, the time of the place of the appointment, where an Abwehr car would pick him up. He'd jump in the back seat and would then hide low in the car as they would come into von Karstoff's villa.
At each meeting, von Karstoff gives several questionnaires to Duško Popov, documents that the spy can carry discreetly, thanks to a surprising technology, the microdot.
A micropunct, or a microdot, is a photographic reduction, typically of a page of text, to a size that it is so small that it is unreadable without some additional form of optical magnification. You can see that there's a dot there, but you can't see what's on it. This was one of the great developments during World War II. Because it was so small, he could keep it hidden, and that way it wouldn't be detected when he crossed a border. The only way he could read it would be simply using a small microscope.
Once back in London, the spy reads the questions asked by the Abwehr. Of course, he transmits these documents to the Double Cross Committee, which provides the answers. Tricycle's playboy, socialite lifestyle provides the committee with the perfect cover to justify the origin of its information. For months, the double agent performs a real balancing act between London and Portugal. The slightest misstep could expose him to the German secret services.
The double agent in dealing with two handlers is dealing with two professionals. Both professionals are always looking for indications of whether or not that double agent is, quote, loyal to them, unquote, or not. And so there will be, during the course of any double agent operation, the double agent will have to face situations where the other side is testing him.
The agent must be vigilant in all circumstances. And he frankly must develop stories to fit whatever he's doing. So if he goes to meet the service that's actually controlling him, he has to have a story to tell the other service, right? So if I go to Portugal, I go to Lisbon, Why am I in Lisbon? I'm in Lisbon for a business reason or some other reason, but he has to have a story to tell the other service. Any mistake he makes can have drastic consequences for him.
Very quickly, Popov becomes one of Abwehr's favorite spies. But the double agent has no idea of the extent of the deception.
None of the agents knew that they were part of a major deception campaign. Each believed that they were operating individually and independently. They didn't even know the real names of their own case officers, who were supposedly, frankly, their best friends.
The Double Cross Committee keeps every agent somewhat in the dark. After devising the misinformation they want to feed to the Germans, the committee fragments it and distributes the seemingly unrelated pieces to the spy masters of the double agents. At the end of the chain, the spies have no sense of the big picture.
The D-Day landings from an intelligence perspective is a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. You're not showing the picture on the lid of the jigsaw puzzle to your enemy. What you're giving him are the pieces of the puzzle, and these pieces don't just fit together, they overlap. And that overlapping is called source verification, and it means that one piece of information authenticates the second piece of information. And you leave it to the enemy, who reach the conclusion that they're already predisposed to believe.
Little by little, a false history is written in parallel to the real one, in which the Allied armies are more numerous, better equipped, and ready to attack the Third Reich in different places. Spreading the deception requires double agents on the front line. One of them will push his commitment to the Allied cause to the extreme. Code names: Garbo on the British side, Alaric on the German side. Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard, is one of the British Crown's best and most imaginative spies. His career begins in 1939 at the end of the Spanish Civil War. Revolted by totalitarianism, he decides to take action against the Nazi ideology, as he relates in his memoirs published in 1986.
I yearned for justice. From the melody of tangled ideas and fantasies going around and around in my head, a plan slowly began to take shape. I must do something practical. I must make my contribution to the good of humanity.
Tamara Chrysler is Agent Garbo's granddaughter and one of the heirs of her grandparents' incredible story.
I don't think that my grandfather and my grandmother decided to become spies. I think it was more the circumstances that took them to this situation. They were very young, they were very enthusiastic, they were dreamers. They had suffered a lot because of the Spanish Civil War. So for them, it was, I don't think it was just, let's become spies, but it was like, we have to do something, whatever, but something. This is, we cannot let the world go this crazy way.
Juan Pujol Garcia and his wife Araceli try to contact the Allied secret services, but the Allies send the inexperienced young couple home. They then approach the German secret services with the aim of feeding them false information. The Germans recruit them as early as 1941. Under the code name Alaric, Garcia begins to provide information, live from London, except that he has never set foot in the British capital.
He had managed to get as far as a village just outside Lisbon called Cascais. From there, he pretended that he was already in England and that he had recruited a KLM civilian aircrew who was traveling on a regular basis, flying between England and Portugal. And this was the explanation for why Alaric's letters were postmarked in Lisbon, because he said his courier would deliver them to the mailbox in Lisbon.
With the aid of tour guides, maps, train schedules, and some British newspapers, Alaric invents himself a whole life in England and sends dozens of letters to his German contact. He and his wife push the trick even further. They pretend that Alaric has recruited other agents, making him the head of a network of spies that exists only in their imagination. They actually created their own misinformation operation without ever hearing about the double-cross committee.
They were freelancers, spies. That, I mean, if you think about it, it's like, who is a freelance spy? Any moment of, it's a pretty peculiar concept of being a freelancer spy.
In April 1942, more than 2 years before D-Day, the English finally notice this prolific informant who earned the trust of the Germans. Juan Pujol Garcia moves to London with his wife, and he joins the double-cross network under the codename Garbo.
The reason why he was codenamed Garbo by the British Security Service was that his case officer thought he was the best actor in the world. He would, as we say, be able to sell snow to the Eskimos. He was a brilliant actor, and he had a unique style. He would take 3 pages to say something that you and I could say in 2 paragraphs.
Under the direction of his spy master, Thomas Harris, Garbo quickly expands his network of fictional informants, creating 27 imaginary agents.
If I were interviewing Garbo, one of the questions I would say is, how'd you keep all these things straight? I mean, keeping 27 agents in balance and so they don't look suspicious to the Germans, that's a very disciplined element to have to deal with day in and day out. A small mistake with one of his sub-agents could really destroy the whole operation.
Thanks to constant vigilance, Garbo and Harris managed to maintain the ruse of all these imaginary informants. Day after day, they perpetuate the disinformation business of Operation Bodyguard, alongside other double agents, real this time.
I also mentioned that on my last visit to Bristol, I noticed a considerable number of American soldiers and officers wearing a big black A.
These are the words of Natalie Sergeyev, aka Lily. Born in Russia, raised in Paris, she offers her services to the Abwehr at the beginning of the war. Like Tricycle and Garbo, she's not a Nazi sympathizer and intends to betray the Germans from the very beginning. As soon as the German secret services send her to London, she applies to MI5 to become a double agent. From now on, her name is Solange for the Abwehr and Treasure for the Allies. But when she settles in England, Treasure makes an unusual demand. She wants her dog, Babs, to travel with her.
Lily Sergeyev was a very difficult woman, a very unusual woman, and the one individual that she had a long-term relationship was her dog, Babs. And she had no understanding, even in the middle of the war, that there were very strict quarantine controls in the United Kingdom because the UK, unlike the rest of Europe, had never had rabies. So absolutely under no circumstances could Babs travel with her until Babs had completed the 6-month quarantine. So a big problem. But it was agreed that she would travel on her own and that Babs would go into quarantine in Gibraltar before following her.
Treasure works hard for the Double Cross Committee. When the Germans send her to describe the insignia of the soldiers she sees during her travels, the committee tells her what to report.
The German intelligence service collected their information from a very limited number of sources. But what they really needed was the Mark I eyeball, for somebody to go into the local village and to see the shoulder flashes, or the insignia on the troops, or the insignia on the tanks, or on the vehicles. The mere observation of a single soldier with insignia in a particular place on a particular date has the effect of authenticating a great deal of other information.
For months, Treasure and others pass thousands of small pieces of information to the Reich. And to make sure these lies are effective, the British Secret Service employs a brilliant tool, the Bletchley Park Decryption Center. Here, more than 8,000 people tried to decrypt German messages. The men of the Reich can keep no secrets from the agents of the British Crown.
You can watch a message delivered by Garbo to Madrid, and you can follow the same message being delivered to Berlin, and then you can see the reaction in Berlin, sending a message, perhaps a questionnaire, seeking more information on particular subjects to Madrid, which is then transmitted to Garbo in another hand cipher. The huge advantage of being able to monitor the enemy traffic is that it was a guarantee that the enemy had been hooked completely and believed the information that they were receiving was authentic.
The intercepted messages leave no room for doubt. The double agents have won the confidence of the Germans. In May 1944, a month before the landing, the Reich's secret services are convinced that the Allied troops are concentrated mainly in the Dover region and on the East Coast. The Germans position their armies according to what they think they know, putting their 3 key divisions in the Calais area. But here is the real position of the Allied troops, massively gathered a little further west, ready to attack the beaches of Normandy. Now, to maintain the deception until the landing, the double agents intensify the urgency of their messages.
Send 50 pounds fast. I need it for my dentist.
This telegram is sent on May 15, 1944 at sender Elvira Josefina Concepcion de la Fuente Chaudoir, alias Agent Bronx. Daughter of a rich Peruvian diplomat, she is known for her partying, seduction, and her love of playing bridge, an excellent cover for transmitting high society gossip. This mundane telegraph hides a coded message for her case officer. The sum of money actually denotes a specific geographical area, the target of an upcoming Allied attack, the Bay of Biscay, north of Spain. The reference to her dentist denotes her level of certainty about the information. Finally, the urgency of her request indicates when this attack will take place. On May 15, 1944, the Abwehr's decoded telegram reads, "In a month, around June 15, an attack will definitely take place in the Bay of Biscay."
What you have in the Bay of Biscay, you have this SS Panzer Division Das Reich, a very consequential unit. And when this message comes through, the military keeps it there. So basically you have this telegram coming through that paralyzes a very consequential unit of the German military. A full SS Panzer division sits in place, waiting for an invasion that never comes.
Operation Bodyguard continues to pay off. The landing is imminent, and the Allies are confident. But suddenly, the unexpected happens. Johnny Jepson, Agent Tricycle's best friend and member of the misinformation network, is arrested by the Gestapo.
He was suspected, rightly, of having embezzled a large amount of money out of the Abwehr. The problem was, would he try and make a deal with the Gestapo? Would he disclose the information that he knew? Would he compromise Dushko Popov? Juan Pujol, codenamed Garbo, was himself under threat because it became clear that information about him had reached Yebsen. So all of this was in the balance when Yebsen was arrested, and that created a major crisis for the Double Cross Committee.
The British Security Service holds its breath. Then, almost at the same time, another threat arises.
When she visited Lisbon, she had fixed up a control sign with Kleeman, which she had not told us about on her return. She refused to divulge what the signal was.
This report is written by Agent Mary Scherer, Treasure's case officer. She reveals that Treasure is threatening to tell her German contact everything. Why? The death of her dog Babs, crushed by a truck while in quarantine abroad.
Lily Sergeyev was interested in only two things: herself and her dog. And in terms of motivation, she was extremely angry about the loss of her dog, to the extent that it jeopardized her mission. There was a danger perceived by MI5 that she might tell the Germans that actually she was operating a double game.
At the end of May 1944, Jepson's arrest and Treasure's threats plunged the Double Cross Committee into crisis. Operation Bodyguard teeters on failure. But too late to call it off. The committee stops Tricycle's activities and prevents Treasure from writing her own reports. They decide Garbo is too valuable to take out of service. On the night of June 5th to June 6th, 1944, just a few hours before the landing, he transmits a message of paramount importance to the Germans.
He wrote to me 3 days ago announcing the distribution of cold rations and vomit bags to the 3rd Canadian Division. After the 3rd Canadian Division had left, Americans came in, rumors having reached him that the 3rd Canadian Division had embarked.
In this letter, Garbo announces the imminent landing in Normandy. It's the truth, the ultimate poker hand for Operation Bodyguard before D-Day.
It was a brilliant stroke of MI5 to get Garbo to send a message on the night of D-Day saying the Allies are coming, to increase Garbo's credibility.
Thanks to this message, Garbo keeps the German Secret Service's confidence. An indispensable ruse to maintain the deception as the Allied ships leave the English coast for Normandy. The Nazi General Staff still believes it is just a diversion. The morning of June 6th, 1944, the big day. "8,000 warships moor off Normandy, and 175,000 men storm the beaches. Meanwhile, in Germany, nobody seems alarmed, not even Hitler.
Hitler was at the Berghof, which was his mountain retreat in the German Alps. On the night of June 5th, he was actually watching movies with Eva Braun and Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels left around 2 o'clock in the morning, and then Hitler went to bed around 3 o'clock. And no one was to disturb him. Hitler himself had anticipated that there would be an attack, but that it would be a diversion in anticipation of a much larger attack. So when news of Normandy came, you didn't want to wake him up for an attack that would prove to be a diversion. Then you realize that in one of the most consequential moments, Hitler slept.
On the beaches of Normandy, the fight rages. In the first 24 hours, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers are killed, wounded, or missing. But the German defenses gradually fall. No reinforcements come to repel the Allies. Jebsen and Treasure did not compromise the operation after all. On the evening of June 6th, the war is far from over. Allied armies must now advance into enemy territory.
What we have to remember is, although in the eyes of the world, the fact the Allies got ashore on D-Day, June the 6th, this is the big day, success, triumph, victory, it was not that simple. The planners had always expected that the key battle would be in the days and weeks that followed, and that if the Germans, after D-Day, were able to reinforce more quickly by land than the Allies by sea, the Germans could still win the battle. And so a huge amount hinged on how quickly the Germans moved their armored divisions from the Pas-de-Calais.
For now, the Germans believe Normandy is a diversionary ploy. They still expect a major attack in the Pas-de-Calais. But how long will they believe it?
After the 6th of June 1944, you might think that the deception campaign would be over, but that was just the first half. The second half was equally as important, and it was to maintain the fiction of the main invasion was due to take place at any moment in the Pas-de-Calais.
As early as June 7th, all the agents still in the race send new reports to their German handlers. They cannot be more explicit. An attack in Calais is imminent.
From the report mentioned, it is perfectly clear that the present attack is a large-scale operation, but diversionary. I never like to give my opinion unless I have strong reasons to justify my assurances.
Only part of Allied force in Normandy operation. Bulk remains here at present.
Fusag was, as I reported, ready to attack at any moment. But it is obvious now that it will be a separate action. Hub.
This last message is sent by Agent Hub for Hubert, British codename Brutus. As a former officer of the Polish Air Force, whose real name was Roman Garbi Cianowski, he was recruited as a double agent 2 years earlier. As D-Day approaches, he becomes an essential player in the deception campaign.
In 1944, he was attached as a liaison officer to Wentworth, which was the supposed headquarters of the 1st United States Army Group, which first of all confirmed the existence of Fusag, and secondly gave an opportunity for direct information to be passed to the Germans about the 1st United States Army Group.
The day after June 6th, Agent Brutus sends a barrage of messages to the Abwehr. His mission, make them believe that Fusag, the fictional army he is a part of, is ready to land in Calais.
Still saw in Brentwood some soldiers of the 351st U.S. Infantry Division. They were currently attached to the 121st U.S. Corps and sent to Kent. Northern regions of Harwich and around Ipswich seem to be prepared as staging areas for boarding.
Given the deluge of supporting information, the Germans feel confident. The lie endures for days and even weeks.
It took 7 weeks for the Germans to finally tumble to the fact that there was not going to be a second invasion. I mean, even in July, there were twice as many troops at the Pas de Calais and at Normandy. Finally, on the 27th of July, 4 panzer divisions are sent from the Pas de Calais down to Normandy. Here we are, you know, a month and a half after the initial invasion.
One among many things that's extraordinary about fortitude is the Allies' biggest hope was they could just maintain uncertainty through D-Day, and then if they were very lucky, they might maintain German uncertainty for a few days. And what was incredible is that it persisted for weeks, that the Germans went on, leaving these forces here in the Pas de Calais. So fortitude was as successful as the Allied hoped at the beginning, but far more successful than they'd ever dared to hope in the days and weeks that followed.
At the end of July 1944, when Hitler finally gives the order to send reinforcements to Normandy, he's too late. The Allies are already progressing through French territory. And on August the 25th, they liberate Paris. The fighting continues for many months, but the die is cast. Reich armies are sandwiched between Allied forces in the west and Russian forces in the east. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet troops invade Berlin, and Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. A week later, on May 8th, Germany surrenders. The Second World War is finally over in Europe. Still today, the landing of June 6, 1944 ranks as one of the most remarkable military events of the 20th century. But history has almost forgotten the extraordinary misinformation campaign that made it happen.
If the deception campaign had failed or been disbelieved or even worse, had been compromised, the consequences would have been absolutely enormous, and failure might have meant that we'd be conducting this interview in German.
The double agents sustained brilliantly confusion in German minds, and the coordination, it was undoubtedly one of the great British success stories of the war. The double agents, the wireless deception, the false information fed to foreign diplomats, all the rest of it. This was brilliantly handled.
At the end of the war, the double agents aren't even aware of the central role they played. Most leave England and resume their normal lives.
After the war, these agents went back to a life of obscurity. Garbo ultimately went to live in Venezuela and was employed by Shell Oil as an interpreter and an English teacher, ended up running a small bed and breakfast in Maracaibo. Tricycle Dushko Popov became a CIA agent, operated in the European community as the director of the iron and steel and coal agreements. Brutus became a printer and operated a small print shop in the Fulham Road in London. Lily Sergeyev married an American Army officer she met in Paris and went to live with him in the United States. Bronx, Elvira de la Fuentes, opened a couturier shop just opposite one of the best hotels in the Riviera in Beaulieu-sur-Mer.
For years, the story of these men and women in the shadows has remained highly classified. But little by little, the veil of secrecy has lifted to reveal these spies who contributed so much to the success of this truly game-changing military operation. By the end of 1942, the Third Reich had extended its influence throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. But on November 8th, the British, American, and Canadian troops land in North Africa and regain control of Morocco and Algeria. Once settled in Maghreb, the next step for the Allied command is clear. Gain a foothold in southern Europe and weaken the Nazi army, already suffering heavy losses on the Eastern Front against the Russians. For this operation, codenamed Husky, the Allies target a little island in the south of Italy, Sicily. Launch date, July 1943. The stakes are high. If Operation Husky succeeds, it could turn the tide of the war, leading to victory for the Allied forces.
It was going to be the greatest, the largest amphibious operation in history. In other words, it was going to be the largest combined attempt by sea to land on enemy country. So it was a huge enterprise. It was going to involve about 150,000 troops, tens of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles. It was a huge operation.
But the Allied headquarters face a major problem. The Germans anticipate an attack in the region and have readied their defenses.
The German high command was absolutely convinced that the Allies were going to launch an attack somewhere in the Mediterranean and southern Europe after their campaign in North Africa. So the Germans focus on a couple of rather logical points. First and foremost is Greece. Other places that the Germans thought it might happen are places like Sardinia or Corsica, and then of course Italy. But the question is precisely which one are the Allies going to come at?
For Operation Husky to succeed, the Allies must force Hitler to move his troops. In great secrecy, Churchill assembles the London Controlling Section, an ultra-secret organization of high-ranking Army and British intelligence personnel. Their mission: to craft a diversion plan to convince the Germans that the attacks will happen not in Sicily, but in Greece and Sardinia. In Kew, a suburb of London, the National Archives has preserved the documents recounting this vast military plot. In top-secret files, two names stand out: Charles Cholmondeley and Ewan Montague, both members of the British intelligence services. They concoct a plan worthy of the greatest spy movies. Its name, Operation Mincemeat. This document details Montague and Cholmondeley's incredible scheme. They want to drop into the sea a corpse dressed like a British officer who died in a plane crash. The body would carry confidential documents suggesting an invasion in Sardinia and Greece. The goal: to let this false information fall into the hands of the Germans.
The whole idea of taking a corpse and using it as a deception tool with such a massive plan behind it, the invasion of southern Europe, is absolutely crazy, for sure. On a balance of probability, if you entertain this in 1942-43, it seems ludicrous. It seems near insane. It's so insane that it's brilliant. And it's also really, really cool. It's got all the elements you could possibly imagine for a cool story. A dead body that's disguised, really interesting players. You know, it's a fantastically interesting story. And there's no question in my mind that the plan that unfolds, the entire Operation Mincemeat, stands as one of, if not the most important, intelligence operations of World War II.
Cholmondeley and Montague work relentlessly to implement this crazy plan. Each detail must be carefully prepared.
Creating a legendary agent as in the case of the mincemeat, represents a one-off type of operation for most intelligence services. So in that sense, I don't believe there's any real template or any particular formula that one has to follow. You are almost, in every instance, is making it up as you go along.
The first step is finding the ideal corpse. But there's one essential requirement. No one should care about it.
The reason that British intelligence needs a body that nobody cares about is because there's too many loose ends. If you take a corpse that has family or friends or dies in a particularly public fashion, there are going to be lots of questions. There are going to be people that want a funeral. There are going to be people that want to file for pension payments. There's all sorts of really, mundane things in the long run that would throw the entire intelligence operation out of the way. There's also moral and ethical considerations. Even in the midst of World War II, people are worried about doing indignities to a body without permission. So they need a corpse that nobody cares about. It's a very sad, morbid occasion, but that's precisely what they needed. No questions means a higher chance of success.
Another requirement. The body must pass as a man who drowned at sea after a plane crash. The condition of his skeleton, his lungs, the level of decomposition. Every detail matters in case the corpse gets autopsied. They enlist the help of a coroner and a forensic pathologist. In these times of war, corpses are not necessarily lacking in London. And yet, the search proves extremely difficult. According to Montagu's report, after 2 months of looking in vain, their luck finally turns. The coroner and pathologist find a potentially interesting cadaver.
On the 28th of January, there had died at St. Stephen's Hospital, Fulham, a labourer of no fixed abode. His name was Glendower Michael, and he was 34 years of age. 2 days earlier, he had taken phosphorus rat poison.
The deceased is a young Welshman who lost his parents and apparently lived cut off from the world. No one seems to care about his disappearance. Did he die from accidentally eating rat poison? Was it suicide? Nobody knows. But for the forensic pathologist, his means of death fits the storyline of Operation Mincemeat.
The rat poison did have the general effect that is known to occur, which is liver failure. Actually, the liver undergoes what is called necrosis, which means death of the liver cells. Even under the best of circumstances, it is rather difficult to detect rat poison, phosphorus. But if you now add to that the idea that the body will begin to undergo decomposition and putrefaction, then it is highly unlikely to even think of rat poison or phosphorus.
For Cholmondeley and Montagu, a death by rat poisoning provides a great opportunity. British intelligence feels confident. With a cause of death so hard to detect, the chances of the Germans to accept the idea of a death by drowning would be even higher. The body of the homeless man is discreetly set aside, held at a temperature of 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, in the morgue of St. Pancras Hospital. According to the pathologist at the time, the body would last for about 3 months. Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley must now construct the legend of this man. so that he can accomplish his post-mortem mission. First, create a credible identity.
They needed to convince the Germans that the courier that they were going to use was a man who would be expected to be holding documents like that. So they choose a major in the Royal Marines. That's a reasonably senior rank, the sort of person that you'd expect to be carrying documents like that. Another reason why they could choose a Royal Marines officer is that they could use a regular British Army uniform. You don't have to bring in a specialist tailor to measure a dead body, and therefore, if you do that, then you're putting your secrets at risk, because how can you trust the tailor that you're bringing in to keep the secrets that he's going to be seeing?
So, here he is, a corpse who's a major with the Royal Marines, in his uniform, and finally, with a name. The hero of Operation Mincemeat is Major William Bill Martin, born in Cardiff in 1907. He just needs a face.
Michael was 34 when he died, so they get a guy at the same age group and approximately the same physique in order to take a photograph, and it's one of their own, an MF5 officer, who gives up his own photograph and his own identity temporarily, wearing the same suit that the body is found in order to appear that it is the same guy.
But to be credible, the character must also have a story, a private life, a personality. What spies call the legend of Major Martin. Who was he? How did he live? Who were his friends, and what were his hobbies? What did he do on his final days in London before leaving on his mission and crashing into the sea? Cholmondeley and Montague step into the shoes of their fictitious hero. They plant clues in the pockets of his uniform. Coins, an open pack of cigarettes, matches, a pair of keys, 2 bus tickets, even a photo of Pam, his fictitious fiancée. He carries 2 used theatre tickets dated April 22nd and a bill from the Naval and Military Club in London where he stayed until April 23rd. This makes it possible to date his departure. Everything stops April 24th, the day he's meant to fly and crash.
They have made Michael, a Welsh vagrant who nobody knew and cared about, sadly, they make him a real person with an entire backstory. And that backstory is painstaking. It's a very interesting moment where you see, the mental acuity of the planners. And then you also really see how clever the operation is. They put artifacts in his wallet and on his person that gives you a very rich tapestry.
The invented life of Major Martin is fully fleshed out. Now, Cholmondeley and Montague move on to the next step of the plan. To determine the exact place to drop the body where the Germans will find it. They know the spot, Huelva in southwest Spain.
Spain during the Second World War was a neutral country. However, it was quite closely aligned with Nazi Germany. Franco, who's in charge in Spain, had a quite close relationship with Hitler. And the reason why the Allies wanted to land documents in Spain in this way was that they felt very strongly that there was a high chance that the Spanish will actually pass the documents that come into their possession, or copies of them, to the Germans.
There was a man in Huelva named Adolf Kloss who was an excellent German spy and a committed Nazi. The Germans knew it, but also the Brits knew it. And they felt that if they could get this into the hands of Kloss, it would end up in the right hands.
Huelva is on the route from Great Britain to North Africa. Major Martin's itinerary takes shape. Flying from London to Algiers, his plane will suffer a tragic fate off the Andalusian coast, where Major Martin will drown near the beach. Now, Cholmondeley and Montague need to find the best way to drop the body into the sea. And most of all, in the perfect location to assure it's found and brought to the Spanish coast.
Several mechanisms were considered for how to deliver the body into the sea off the west coast of Spain. One of these was to land it by basically to drop the body from the air, but that was dismissed because the body would become damaged once it being dropped from a height into the water. Another suggestion was to drop it by ship, but again the danger there was that it might be seen. It could be seen by the shore. Another idea was landing it by a seaplane, a flying boat, but in the end the decision was taken to drop it from a submarine. A submarine could reach the coast quietly, unseen, and then it could just gently slip the body into the water and then leave without being seen as well. So in the end they settled on the submarine option.
The submarine HMS Seraph is due to leave Scotland on April 19, 1943 for North Africa. It's a perfect schedule, providing Major Martin's last voyage, along with the documents he carries. Those crucial documents, the bait in an elaborate trap. The fictitious Major is supposedly flying to the Allied headquarters in Algiers. So he carries letters intended for officers stationed in North Africa. To justify sending them by special courier, the letters must be both personal and of the utmost importance.
As with most intelligence operations, it's not the big failures that get you, it's the small ones. The people running this operation knew absolutely that any detail that was checkable would be checked, and it had to fit with the story they were representing and had to be not only plausible, but reasonable. What can the Germans reasonably find out about a person who would have been in Major Martin's position? Do the British have couriers like this? Are there staff officers like this? Is there a reasonable plausibility that a person would be carrying these papers on a flight and then somehow be killed? And that had to appear reasonable to them.
After many drafts, General Archibald Nye writes the first letter and signs it personally. The recipient, his friend, General Harold Alexander, stationed in Tunisia.
It was agreed by the Chief of Staff that the 5th Division should be reinforced by 1 brigade group for the assault on the beach south of Cape Araxos, and that a similar reinforcement should be made for the 56th Division at Kalawata. Jumbo Wilson had proposed to select Sicily as cover target for Husky.
The first document is absolutely key because it's in this document that the principal target is outlined as Greece. That's the deception that the Allies want to put over to the Germans. The letter is to suggest that the invasion, codename Husky, is actually going to Greece, and that the Sicily operation is actually a cover. Mentioning the word Husky in the operation is quite interesting because that suggests that they want the Germans to believe, if they ever come across that codename Husky in other documents or through their own spies, that's a real operation, but in fact it's going somewhere else. It might seem risky to use the real codename in an operation, but actually there's some thought behind that.
To complete the story, Major Martin carries 2 more letters.
The second letter is another important letter. It is written again by a very senior British officer, Mountbatten, and it's a letter introducing Major Martin to Admiral of the Fleet Cunningham, who is a very senior naval officer in the Mediterranean. It is designed to convince the Germans that this is a real man who is on a mission. But there's also one interesting element to the letter which is also built into the deception, and that's the final line.
Let me have him back, please. As soon as the assault is over, he might bring some sardines with him. They are on points here.
The joke about sardines is, I think, one of the most risky but also the most brilliant little component. It's a reference to the fact that the British were in fact possibly entertaining an attack on Sardinia, hence sardines. Where the brilliance come in is that the British understood, the Germans understood British humor. So it's this kind of, I know what you know kind of thinking.
It's interesting when you think about these guys sitting in London, dreaming up these operations. And in some ways, that's even deeper than just piling up military equipment to fake an operation. This one is the ability to think your way into the mind of the German military and into Hitler himself, and to deliver those things that reinforce an instinct, which ultimately was wrong.
But Cholmondeley and Montague have a problem. If the two letters are put in a simple envelope, in Major Martin's uniform pocket, they could slip out and be lost after several days at sea. Losing the letters would jeopardize the entire operation. They decide to add a third letter, accompanied by a military pamphlet by Eisenhower. The pamphlet, too big for a simple envelope, justifies the use of a government briefcase.
The reason for the use of a briefcase was that they wanted the Germans to see it. They wanted it to be found. They wanted the Spanish, or whoever found the body, to find this briefcase and realize there were documents in it.
To be sure the briefcase will not be lost, they attached it to Major Martin with a chain. This will also reinforce the importance of the documents. To simulate death by a plane crash, our man is decked out with a life jacket and a rubber dinghy. With every detail of the plan in place, on April 15th, 1943, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, gives it the go-ahead.
And the good news is that Winston Churchill is an aficionado of intelligence. He thinks it's big, he thinks it's clever, he thinks it's going to work. And of course, he had hesitation, like any leader would, because, as he famously said, anybody but a fool would believe we're coming to Italy. But the Germans were foolish. So there's a possibility that they're going to actually buy it and move to Greece.
Churchill has just one requirement: get approval on the American side from General Eisenhower, who grants an authorization 2 days later.
Chief of Staff, on behalf of General Eisenhower, gives full approval. Mincemeat.
Operation Mincemeat can commence. On April 17th, 1943, Cholmondeley and Montague return to the morgue one last time. According to official reports, the two men slip all the objects in Major Martin's pockets and attach his briefcase with the confidential documents. The corpse is then placed in a custom-made steel box. But for some, especially the forensic pathologist, Dr. Peter Speth, this scenario doesn't hold. Glendower Michael's cadaver has suffered too many temperature changes since his death 3 months prior.
In my opinion, when Montague went to the morgue on the 17th to get the body out of the freezer, I think what really happened was, oh my God, we can't use this body. What are we gonna do? He was just too badly decomposed. The stench would have been so overwhelming, so unbearable.
For Dr. Speth, there is no doubt. Glendower Michael never left London. At the last moment, Cholmondeley and Montague might have replaced his body with the corpse of a young Marine who died a few days earlier in Scotland, when the aircraft carrier HMS Dasher exploded.
You only have Ewan Montague's book and the documents as a source. And it's impossible to know if there was a switch. I do think you can understand why they would have preferred the drowned body of a young British sailor. That would have been perfect. Certain things puzzle me a little bit about Martin's using Glendower Michael. I think there's room for speculation. And I think there's room for an open mind. And we have to remember that we're dealing with deception. And the deception may have continued after the war for various reasons. It's difficult to know.
Part of me says, yeah, it's quite plausible because, of course, the British government would want to keep that stuff secret. Had you employed another body, there are all sorts of moral, ethical, legal considerations that go into the calculation. So I understand why people believe that stuff. And this is a world of conspiracies. Many of them turn out to be true, I suppose, so I get it. All that being said, the best evidence that we have from people that have spent a lot of time researching every component is that it was, in fact, Glendower's body. So barring any release of government evidence from the British in particular, we are sort of inclined to go with the official story, which is super interesting.
We may never know who boarded the submarine HMS Seraph in a sealed canister on April 19th at 6 o'clock. But whoever he is, he carries with him all hope for Operation Mincemeat. "11 days later, at 4:15 a.m., Bill Jewell, the captain of the submarine, along with 5 officers who learn of the plan last minute, surface and come out on deck. They're 1,500 meters off the coast of Huelva, where they drop the corpse into the open sea. Early in the morning, fishing for sardines like any other day, an Andalusian fisherman discovers the body of the English Royal Marine. He brings him to the coast and hands him over to Spanish authorities. But things will not go according to plan.
The British plan had basically hoped that Spanish fishermen or somebody in the water in Spain would find the corpse, turn it over immediately to the Spanish military or Spanish police, and it would end up, contents included, all of the documents, in German hands. The problem is that the Spanish authorities refused to turn over the body and refused to turn over the documents.
Even worse, the Spanish authorities decide to conduct an autopsy. The first test of the British agents' elaborate scheme.
According to Montague, they were shocked and very concerned when they found out that the body was transported by ferry up the river to Huelva and that the medical examiner would perform an autopsy. They were assuming, particularly because they made the body to appear to be a Catholic, that the body would simply be looked at, yeah, probably drowned, and then be buried. They had never counted on a forensic pathologist or medical examiner conducting an autopsy.
It was a relatively thorough examination in the sense that they did exactly what most autopsies would do. They have questions, but they come up with answers. One of them notes that it appears to have been, further decomposed than a regular body would, even after 4 or 5 days in the ocean, which is, of course, exactly what the operation was designed to avoid in the first place. So there's this enormous tension while the British wait to see how this has been digested by Spanish authorities.
As the Spanish doctors conduct the autopsy, some other details puzzle them. One is the position of the corpse's hairline. it appears to be much further back than in the photograph discovered on the body. Will the doctors conclude that the body they're autopsying is not the man in the picture?
The Spanish doctor says, well, you know, the receding of the hairline would be consistent with the attrition and movement of the skin on the scalp in terms of the water and the effects of the salt in the water in shaping the hairline. So what the autopsy does is bring up legitimate questions, as opposed to an autopsy to say, don't worry about it, everything's fine, but at the same time provide answers.
Despite the questions raised by the autopsy, the Spanish authorities reached the conclusion the Allies had hoped for. Officially, the man drowned at sea, and his body remained immersed for 8 to 10 days before being found.
I think there was a real incentive to want to believe it and to overlook some of the realities around it. I think had there been a thorough autopsy, the results may have shown something very different. But this was all very rushed. Get it together and get it up to Berlin and score a victory, you know, with the Fuhrer.
On May 2nd, William Martin is buried in Huelva in the presence of British Army officials. But British intelligence now faces another unexpected move. Instead of giving the briefcase with all the documents to the Germans after the autopsy, the doctors give it to Spanish Navy officials.
And the Navy is far less for the Germans and Italians than is the Army. And there is a kind of sense of Spanish pride and sovereignty about it, which you can understand. And not everybody in Spain was all that loyal to Franco, let alone to the idea of Germans and Italians as overlords. There were quite a few people in Spain who were much fonder of the Allies than of the Axis powers.
The Spanish Navy refuses to give the British major's briefcase to the Nazi officials. On the German side, the race begins to get their hands on the documents. Adolf Klaus, the most active spy in Huelva, goes into action. But not one officer will open the envelopes for Agent Klaus. All he receives is a detailed list of the documents and objects found on the body. For both sides, the Spanish loyalty to the British is a catastrophe. The briefcase leaves the small port of Huelva for Madrid to be handed over to the British authorities. But the Reich agents don't give up, and they finally get lucky. At least, that's what they believe. On May 8, 1943, pro-Nazi Spanish officers unseal the envelopes in Major Martin's briefcase. The operation is extremely delicate. The British authorities cannot find out that the letters were opened by their enemies. Once opened, the letters are given to German agents, who have less than 1 hour to photograph them. The Spanish officers carefully return the letters to their envelopes. They immediately send the photos to Berlin. The Fremde Heer, an intelligence organization of the Reich, is responsible for verifying their authenticity. At the head of the investigation, Alexei von Rohen, Hitler's favorite intelligence analyst. With his team, he scrupulously studies all the elements at his disposal. But something doesn't add up. According to the Spanish forensic pathologist, the body spent 8 to 10 days in the water before being discovered on April 30th. But in one of Major Martin's pockets is an invitation to a party at a London cabaret club, dated April 27th.
The British put this invitation with the intention of just adding to his personal items. The Germans interpreted this as an event that he had actually attended and did the math on it and said, you know, this must have been one of the last things he did before he left London, and then he shows up dead in Spain, and they can't square the condition of the body based on the autopsy report with the fact that a couple of days earlier he had been at a club in London.
For the Brits, the invitation was an unimportant detail, and now it's about to jeopardize the entire operation.
In the Second World War, counterintelligence services are very good. If a counterintelligence service suspects something, they will pull that string until they unravel everything they can.
Alexei von Rohen asks Spain for more information. The local Abwehr office replies that there is absolutely no doubt of the letter's authenticity. But the Germans aren't convinced. Some of those closest to Hitler, like Goebbels, remain skeptical of this seemingly God-sent information. Thankfully, though, within the secretive powers of the Third Reich, only one man has the last word.
Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what Goebbels or anyone else thinks, it's what Hitler thinks. And when it ends up on Hitler's desk, he's convinced that it's the real thing.
In a regime like the Nazis, failure is not really an option. If you manage to upset somebody in the chain of command, especially Hitler, chances are you end up with a bullet in your head. So no matter how intelligent and capable German intelligence can be, it's horribly undermined by ideological and political concerns. So all of this leads the Germans to hear what they want to hear and believe what they want to believe.
The Führer himself is convinced that the Allies are preparing an attack against Greece and Sardinia. But meanwhile, England has no idea that the Germans finally arrived at that conclusion. It's been days since surveillance teams have intercepted enemy communications, and they found no messages about William Martin's letters.
From the placement of the body in the sea up for the next few weeks, there is real tension in London. I would sort of characterize it as near panic because everything could go possibly wrong with this enterprise. And it must have been agonizing because there's pretty much dead silence coming from either the Spanish or the Germans. So there's tension, there's confusion, and there's a lot of trepidation about what could go wrong. And again, it's not because of the body per se, it's because there are invasion plans for Southern Europe which are at stake here, and many thousands of lives are involved, so it's a big stakes game.
Finally, on May 14th, 1943, 2 weeks after the body was dropped in the sea, the long-awaited signal finally arrives.
The German had information from an absolutely reliable source that large-scale Allied landings were projected in the near future in both the eastern and western Mediterranean.
The Allies are relieved. The ploy seems to have worked as planned. But the landing in Sicily is scheduled for July 10th, 2 months later. The lie has to endure. So the Allied secret services take drastic steps to misinform and maintain the enemy's illusion.
The British use quite a few double agents, or agents of their own, who are sending false information to Germany. For example, In the UK, you have Agent Tricycle, and he sends the Germans fake observations of Allied movements in Scotland and the United Kingdom to suggest that they're preparing for an invasion in Greece. In North Africa, there was also a fake army, an entire fake army, the 12th Army, with 12 divisions, was invented, completely fictional. And that was using things like inflatable tanks, inflatable trucks that could be seen from the air or from the spies, who might think they looked genuine. There were soldiers who were moving around, who of course were not really going to take part in an invasion, but were part of a fake division. There were Greek currency, Greek newsletters, Greek guidebooks were issued among these troops and were in circulation in North Africa to suggest that this fictional army was actually destined for Greece. So a huge amount of effort was put in to create a make-believe army that never actually existed.
The best way to view Operation Mincemeat is to liken it to a jigsaw puzzle, an enormously complicated jigsaw puzzle with thousands of pieces. One out of place could throw the entire picture down the tube. And in that sense, the intricacy, the complexity of this program, from planning everything about the body all the way up to feeding into the German intelligence system, is unbelievably risky. It is lunacy.
From the start, the plan was crazy, but it works. In early summer, Hitler orders 18,000 men from the 1st Panzer Division in France to head to Greece. They are joined by torpedo boats from Sicily, and minefields are installed along the Greek coast. In Sardinia, the Germans double their presence and send 10 more armed divisions to protect the Balkans. The Führer's message to the Allies is clear. We know about your plan to attack, and you will not succeed. But the Allies do attack, where Hitler least expects it. On July 10th, 1943, 160,000 men and 600 tanks arrive on Sicily's coast.
When the invasion came, the first lines of resistance that the Allies hit, many of them were Italian soldiers, and it became quite clear that these were second-rate, second-class soldiers. And this, I think, is also evidence of the fact that the enemy, the Germans and the Italians, did not feel that a strong invasion was coming. So they put troops in the front line there who weren't first-class troops.
The Allied assault doesn't worry the German military. On the same day that the fighting is raging on the Sicilian beaches, 21 fighter planes leave the island to head to Sardinia.
Hitler is absolutely convinced that the invasion will come on Greece, Sardinia, and even after the invasion has taken place, he sees this as a diversionary action, still waiting for the big attack to come in Greece.
After several weeks, the Allies finally take the city of Messina on August 17th, 1943, ending the campaign in Sicily. For the Nazi Empire, this breach signals the beginning of the end. During the following months, the Allied forces will regain Italy, and in 1944 will land in Normandy and Provence, before ultimately invading Berlin in April 1945. Where Hitler will commit suicide.
The campaign in Italy is key to the Allies because it draws German forces away from the Eastern Front and it draws German forces away from the Western Front after the Allies land there in 1944. So it soaks up enemy resources, and that's exactly what the Allies wanted to achieve.
Today, seeing the full scale of the Allied forces to liberate Europe. Operation Mincemeat seems like a small detail of World War II. And yet the scheme, stranger than fiction, is unprecedented in the history of intelligence.
You couldn't write a novel like this, it wouldn't be credible. But, you know, the combination, I think, of the creativity but also the insight and the luck all combined to make an astonishing operation and a consequential outcome that I think one can really admit saved tens of thousands of lives.
Mincemeat is an example of great ingenuity, inventiveness, and just the way that the human mind can work and can think up the most extraordinary schemes. It is an operation that I think today, when we look back on it, we might take it almost for granted. But if you put yourself in the shoes of Cholmondeley and Montague at the beginning, you know, it's an amazing thing to have thought up. It's a fantastic success of creative thinking.
These two men at their core are imaginative, gifted creators, if you like. They're really no different than your Steven Spielbergs or whoever else in today's world who are so creative to make the imagination run a little bit wild. And they were blessed to have a team, and that includes high political leaders like Eisenhower and Churchill, who, whether through desperation or confidence, decided to put it into play. And it works magnificently.
Like a grain of sand in the Germans' well-oiled war machine, the plan crafted by Montague and Cholmondeley played a crucial role in the success of the Sicily invasion and changed the course of the war.
There's so many things that go into World War II, right? It's military, political thinking, economics. But yes, in a very real sense, this operation changes the nature of the war. It allows the Allies to get a foothold into Italy, to throw out Mussolini, to make vulnerable the German defenses. It saves countless numbers of lives, and it puts Germany on the defensive even more than they already were. So ironically, an unknown Welsh vagrant drunk who dies of rat poisoning becomes the most important man in World War II? Sure, I think there's some reason to suggest that's actually the case.
Without having ever existed, Major Martin contributed to the fall of the Nazi Empire. Today, his body still rests in Huelva, Spain. But the British government has added another name on the grave. Glyndŵr Michael, who died at the age of 34. The man who never was becomes the man he was at the start. A Welshman who, without ever knowing it, saved thousands of Allied lives after his death.
Соединенные Штаты Америки
aggression and subversion will not be profitable routes.
Смогут дать отпор любому агрессору.
The right of self-determination for all people.
Who can best stand up to Khrushchev?
In the early 1960s, US President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Union Secretary General Nikita Khrushchev berate one another in their public speeches. It's the height of the Cold War, and the world is ideologically torn in half. In the West, the liberal bloc led by the US. In the East, the Soviet bloc headed by the powerful USSR. Separated by an iron curtain, the two giants provoke each other with the threat of atomic weapons. Suddenly, in the heart of the Caribbean, a small Soviet enclave turns up the heat on the Cold War. Its name, Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy declares the immediate establishment of a naval blockade around the island to halt any new weapon deliveries. The news hits like a shockwave. Will the two world powers attack each other, triggering World War III?
If Premier Khrushchev decided to ignore the naval quarantine, there's every realistic expectation that we would have had war. And given the circumstances in 1962, the chances that that would have escalated to a thermonuclear war are very, very high.
One path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory.
While the world holds its breath, President Kennedy remains remarkably calm. His secret, a fortuitous source of information located in the heart of Soviet power, in Moscow.
That goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
The key to averting nuclear war begins one summer night when strangers meet on the Moskv-Veretsky Bridge. A man enjoying the view, and two American interns, Eldon Ray Cox and Henry Lee Cobb, returning from the Bolshoi Ballet. The gentleman asks for a light, and then approaches them with a more unusual request.
He says, I have a package here. I want you to take it to a particular man. The man he identifies is the security officer at the American Embassy in Moscow. And I want you to take this package to him right away.
The man hands the students 2 envelopes. Then he disappears into the night.
Cox and Cobb are sitting there and say, what should we do? Well, Cox says, I'm going to take it down. Cobb says, no, this is a setup. I want nothing to do with this. I'm going to go back to my hotel room. So they parted ways, and then Cox took a taxi, and he went to the American Embassy.
Here at CIA headquarters, the most sensitive archives of American history are preserved. Most are classified top secret. But among the documents handed off by the mysterious man on the bridge were 2 identical typewritten letters made public a few years ago. Originally written in Russian, they were translated into English by the U.S. Embassy.
My dear sir, it is your good friend who is turning to you. A friend who has already become your soldier warrior for the ideal of a truly free world, to which your, and now my, president, government, and people are sacrificing so much effort. I ask that you believe the sincerity of my thoughts. At the present time, I have at my disposal very important materials on many subjects of exceptionally great interest and importance to your government.
The letters aren't signed. Who is this mystery man? And what does he really want? Enclosed with the letters is a single photograph. Still classified today, it gave the CIA a lead to pursue his identity.
When they open up the package in the American Embassy, they find a photograph of a man in a military uniform with the head cut off and an arrow that goes down and says, I am. And in there also is the photograph of an American military officer that had been a military attaché in Turkey.
He knows that by having that picture, we're going to be able to look back at the diplomatic record from the time. We'll be able to reach out to the Army colonel, and we'll be able to figure out who's in the picture. It was a good ploy on his part.
Thanks to the photograph and the students' descriptions, the CIA quickly tracks down the mysterious informant. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. During World War II, this brilliant Soviet officer rose through the ranks of the Red Army. In 1949, he enrolled in the Military Diplomatic Academy, where future agents are trained for the GRU, the Soviet Intelligence Agency. At just 30 years old, he is promoted to colonel. Then after starting his career in Turkey, he becomes Deputy Director of Coordination for Scientific Research at the Soviet Committee. His mission? To gather technical knowledge from countries in the West.
On paper, he most certainly is a poster boy. He's an emblem of the Soviet regime. His rise, if you look at his resume, it's very consistent with many people in senior levels of military and intelligence. And in that effect, he's a kind of, a regular product. He's a shining example of the Soviet system. So the initial reaction of particularly the CIA is this guy's got to be a plant. He's got to be, in effect, feeding disinformation. He's working for the KGB or the GRU against us. It's too good to be true.
Despite the risk of a trap, the CIA sends an intelligence officer to Moscow to contact Oleg Penkovsky. If the man's motivations are honest, the West would have its first mole in the heart of Soviet power, an opportunity impossible to let slip by. In the spring of 1961, the meeting finally happens. The businessman and British MI6 contact Greville Wynne hosts a delegation of engineers and scientists in London. At the head of this small group is Oleg Penkovsky. At the Mount Royal Hotel, Greville Wynne informs the Soviet colonel he's expected in Suite 360 by Western officers.
There are two CIA officers there, Joe Brulig and George Kieswalter. George Kieswalter being kind of key because he was famous for his incredible Russian skills, but also his way of connecting with Russians. And then there was Sergei Shergold and Michael Stokes on the MI6 side. So you had four very experienced officers meeting with him.
The interrogation begins.
In every human operation run by any intelligence service, you get a new source. Your first question is this man bona fide? In other words, is he legitimate? Is he who he says he is? And is he doing it for the reason he says? Or has he been sent as a deception operation to deceive us? In the business, we call this asset validation. So they're going to start the process of a very thorough, very friendly debriefing as to how he comes to be that he wants to be in the room with these four intelligence officers.
During this first meeting, the officers learned that Colonel Penkovsky's rising career within the GRU has recently stalled. His problems started 4 years earlier in 1956. While on assignment in Turkey, he denounced the head of the GRU station in Istanbul for corruption. But instead of listening to Penkovsky's complaints, Moscow buries the case and brings Penkovsky home. Soon after Penkovsky returned to Russia, the KGB launched an investigation on him. And what they discovered jeopardized any chance for promotion.
About a year ago, I was called up by the chief of the personnel directorate, who questioned me about my father. He said, "This is what you have declared your background to be, and this is what we have found out about your father. You said your father simply died. This is because my father was a white officer."
The KGB discovered that Penkovsky's father had fought alongside the Tsar against the Bolshevik revolutionaries in the late 1910s. It's a serious offense.
Had this come out earlier, he never would have ended up in the GRU. Once it came out in his KGB reinvestigation, they determined he and his family could never go overseas again. Penkovsky was coming up on 25 years of service and had this tainted white Russian background. He was going to get retired, he believed. He was never going to be promoted to general. He was never going to be among those that really had access to the best that there was inside the Soviet Union. And so Penkovsky saw himself in this race against time, that he had to build up such a credit within MI6 and CIA that when and if he got retired and lost all of this access, that he would be able to eventually defect and have a good life.
During the first meetings, the officers try to unravel Oleg Penkovsky's very intricate personality and complicated motivations.
Still today, we have great questions about what Penkovsky's motivations were. Not every expert on Penkovsky would necessarily agree what was the principal trigger. Oleg Penkovsky is a curious figure. He was profoundly arrogant. He may have had delusions of grandeur about both his own importance and where he could serve the Americans and the British. And we know from almost every account, especially his interrogators, that one of his motivations became the idea that he was treated unfairly in the Soviet system. And there's no question that was accelerated once Khrushchev became the official. He detested Khrushchev. He didn't like anything about the man. It's not well documented how well he knew Khrushchev, if at all, but he came to the assumption that Khrushchev was reckless and dangerous in his behavior, foreign affairs in particular. So between those two things, there was this initiative, if you like, or motivation to betray.
He's very concerned about Khrushchev. So he's very concerned about what he's going to do with nuclear weapons. So he's very concerned about where his country is going. He sees himself as a patriot, and he says somebody needs to know what is happening in this country.
During his stay in London, Penkovsky holds a series of meetings with the CIA and MI6. 16 interviews take place over 15 days. 52 hours altogether.
The reason Penkovsky was able to go and meet for 52 hours and not be missed was every time he came to the West, he would come with this giant shopping list, not just for his family, but for all of their friends. And so what we would do to help account for his time is we would fill his shopping list, and then he would spend his time giving us secrets. And then he would come back to his room and he would have these shopping bags. Okay, everybody understands what he's been doing. He's out buying all of those things that everyone back in the Soviet Union wanted and couldn't get.
These hundreds of pages of transcribed conversations reveal specifics about the GRU, the heart of USSR intelligence. It's an organization that Penkovsky knows inside and out, because he's inside.
The technical documents he brought out were amazing, were great. He compromised over 300 KGB and GRU officers. Names, photographs later on, that was wonderful. If we had never had another meeting with him after that first group, he still would have paid for himself. I mean, the amount of material he brought out was just staggering.
The Americans and the British are absolutely stunned about what they're hearing from him. He is the golden goose. He has a wealth of information and insight that they've never had before.
But as his time in London comes to an end, he must also wrap up his meetings in Suite 360.
At the end of the 52 hours, the 4 officers realized that they had a tremendous resource here. But they also had a resource who was soon going to go back into the most difficult handling environment you could face.
Immediately, it was decided that they needed to have a collection capability in Moscow so that they could pass information and receive information from him in Moscow. This is very, very dangerous to do because there's 7,000 people on the surveillance team of the KGB in Moscow alone. So it's very difficult to run a human source in Moscow. But the decision was they had to do it.
Back in the Soviet capital, despite the risks, Oleg Penkovsky continues working for his new Western allies. With his official passes, he can access the special collection at the Artillery High Command Library. This is where the regime keeps its most confidential documents about their military arsenal development. the CIA provided him with a Minox, a miniature camera, a tiny technological marvel.
During World War II, the Minox camera became the perfect spy camera for copying documents for a couple reasons. Number one, it was very small. It was easy to conceal. Number two, at a time in which cameras were typically very large, something so small to fit in your hand was certainly non-threatening. The third thing was that it had incredibly sharp lenses, and it could focus easily, where at 20 centimeters you could take a picture of a full page of documents with between 36 or 50 exposures per cassette. It could go from your pocket. Simply open it, it automatically would cock the shutter when you do. You look at a document, get it the proper height, snap the picture. This is literally done in seconds. And it was used by all of the major intelligence services during World War II.
For days, the spy photographs countless documents in total secrecy. Penkovsky sends the microfilms to his contact, Greville Wynne, the organizer of the first meeting in London. The British industrialist often travels between the East and the West, so for MI6 and the CIA, he's the ideal go-between. In 1961, between early May and late June, Penkovsky delivers highly important tactical documents. The originals are still classified as top secret. But these lists, issued by the CIA, illustrate their wealth of information.
He had access to this document called Soviet Military Thought, a journal, and that top secret level journal, which we have thousands of now, was where the Army and the KGB and the GRU would truly debate the future of the Soviet Union and tactics and where things should go and how they should be done. So that was unique. It was so good that here at the CIA, we continued to use that material through the 1980s to help train young analysts on how to look at a country, how to consider the entirety of a country.
The CIA officers decide it's time to disseminate the information from Oleg Penkovsky. But in order to protect their invaluable source, under no circumstance can they reveal his identity. From here on out, the spy's name must remain an absolute secret. The intelligence he has provided is separated into several categories, as if from different informants.
We separated the information into one compartment called Iron Bark, which was the Soviet military thought, the documentary material that he photographed, and another one called Chickadee. And Chickadee was some documentary material, it was the GRU material, it was also his comments on various aspects of the Soviet Union. And we would create lists that were called bigot lists, right, that said, these people have access to Iron Bark, these people had access to Chickadee, some people had access to both. And even in discussions internally or in messages back and forth, we never used his name. We would use cryptonyms, and he had a variety of cryptonyms. Even internally, even among the most trusted sources, we kept trying to ensure that people didn't connect the dots and see that this one guy is producing all this information.
Among the information delivered by Oleg Penkovsky, one topic will turn the tide of the Cold War: the range and power of the Soviet military arsenal. According to the new double agent, the US has highly overestimated Russia's strength. By the late 50s, both the USA and the USSR possessed the atomic bomb. Each side is also racing to construct the most powerful missiles possible, with the longest range and the greatest precision. The US is convinced of Soviet superiority in what the leaders call the missile gap.
They covet no territory.
In 1960, before Kennedy, takes office, the United States is basically blind. It has no real understanding of Soviet military capacity, nuclear capacity. It doesn't know anything about systems, and it has this belief that Soviet missiles must be in the tens of thousands, that they are way further ahead than they actually are, and importantly, that they're further ahead of the United States. So this missile gap psychosis, I think you could call it, this conviction that a missile gap exists and the Russians are ahead of us, is what Kennedy assumes when he takes office.
Oleg Penkovsky suggests that the dreaded missile gap is an illusion. He claims the majority of the Soviet nuclear missiles aren't even operational. Nikita Khrushchev is just an extremely talented liar.
In such large questions of strategic rockets and attacks with strategic weapons, he lies and puts out what he wants as if it were true. Believe me, he lies like a gray stallion.
Penkovsky's information on the weak Soviet arsenal makes its rounds to prominent figures in the CIA and other government agencies. But the secrecy surrounding this new source raises doubts, especially as Penkovsky's disclosures contradict the most deeply held beliefs about Soviet strength.
The orthodox interpretation of the Soviet Union up until Penkovsky's revelations are that we are trailing the Soviet Union in its capacity, that the Soviets have a far better, particularly missile system capacity than we do. And that goes all the way through the American military, all the way through American intelligence, all the way to the electorate. So now, in effect, you're asking all of that to flip, everybody to change their viewpoints, and some people aren't prepared to do that. There are members of the US military who say, no, this has to be false. It has to be either disinformation by the Soviets or at the very least is really dubious information. And I suppose it's fair to say in some of their minds they don't want to hear any different. It doesn't serve their interests. In the 1960s, there's a massive economic infrastructure behind the US military and its acquisition of more and more weapons. So nobody in that complex really likes to hear that Penkovsky has flipped the idea of the Soviet Union no longer being the number one, but the number two.
Because of this pushback, in June 1961, intelligence authorities decide to withhold Penkovsky's revelations from President Kennedy. But at the same time, Penkovsky continues to work in the shadows. Penkovsky now has a new contact to pass his covert documents to. Janet Chisholm, 31 years old, mother of 3, and married to a member of MI6 stationed at the Moscow embassy.
Janet had been a secretary earlier in MI6, so she wasn't totally a trained officer, but on the other hand, it was very common, especially in those days, for families and spouses to play a role.
On this day, Penkovsky is supposed to pass Janet Chisholm a letter with 7 microfilms hidden inside a box of chocolates.
They did this pass very smoothly, where he came out, sees the kids, brings out the box of chocolates. She takes the box, leans back, puts them in her purse, and immediately brings out a real box, identical real box of chocolates, and he goes on his way, and it was beautifully done. Quick pass.
The CIA analyzes the microfilm and letter. The contents pertain to a city beset by major tensions since World War II, Berlin. After the surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945, the victors divide the country. Berlin, the capital, is enclosed in the Russian zone, but the Allies decide to cut the city into four. To the east, the Soviets. To the west, the Americans, the British, and the French. Berlin is the only place on the globe where the two world superpowers stand face to face.
Basically what you have are two camps, two ideological and political and economic camps, facing off over a couple of streets in downtown Berlin. It's a strange situation, a very strange situation. And the only reason that there's a sense of normalcy in Berlin is because they become somewhat used to a four-party rule in their city, complete with police vehicles that have one member of each police force, a British, a French, an American, and a Russian, traveling around the city. You know, the abnormal and unusual becomes the normal. But that doesn't negate the fact that ultimately you have two colossal superpowers looking at each other across city streets in a very small location in downtown Berlin.
But one morning in the summer of 1961, the world wakes up astounded to discover a wall running 97 miles long and 13 feet high through the heart of Berlin. The German capital is literally cut in two. Friends, couples, entire families are separated by the wall. The outrageous move shocks the Allies. After Russia's unexpected move in Berlin, Oleg Penkovsky gives to the CIA a hint about their next one. Nikita Khrushchev plans to kick the Western Allies out of the German capital.
A recent report from a source, judged at this time to be reliable, states that Soviet and satellite forces will be brought to a high state of combat readiness in exercises of unprecedented scope, beginning in early October.
What Khrushchev had threatened in Berlin was basically war, that he was going to sign this peace treaty with the Germans, that he was going to close off the roads and airports again, that this was literally a high potential for war. And he was going to do it within a year.
But in his reports, Penkovsky goes further. After revealing Nikita Khrushchev's goals for Berlin, he asserts that the United States should stand firm against Russia's saber-rattling. Considering the high risk of a Third World War, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, decides it's time to inform President Kennedy.
Chief amongst that information was the idea that Khrushchev was bluffing. And repeatedly, Kennedy heard from Penkovsky's information that Khrushchev was full of bluster, that everything that Khrushchev had ever said and done was in effect just a giant bluff to disguise the fact that the Soviet Union was far weaker than it actually was, militarily weaker, and also that Khrushchev, had no real intention of resolving any situation by force. So in that light, Kennedy went into this entire crisis with a kind of confidence.
For a city or a people.
The Americans are now convinced that Soviet military superiority is fiction. President Kennedy finally decides to follow Penkovsky's advice and take a stand.
The people of West Berlin today have that freedom. It is the objective of our policy that they will continue to enjoy it.
On October 21st, 1961, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense gives a public statement in Palm Springs, California. It was not filmed, but the text has been carefully preserved in CIA archives.
Berlin is the emergency at the moment because the Soviets have decided to make it so. We have called up 150,000 reservists, increased our draft calls. Our forces are so deployed and protected that a sneak attack could not effectively disarm us. We have a second strike capability, which is at least as extensive as what the Soviets can deliver by striking first.
The speech by the American Secretary of Defense in October 1961 is really a landmark occasion. It articulates the fact that the American position has changed, one from a conviction that they are behind the Soviet Union to the reality that they are in fact in the lead. And this is really one of the first times that the public, both American and international, is introduced to that idea.
The Americans officially announced that they no longer believe in the missile gap. On the Soviet side, it's a reality check. If the US no longer believes their lies, it's because someone has been feeding them intelligence. In the most watched-over city in the world, the vice slowly starts to tighten around Colonel Penkovsky. At the end of 1961, Penkovsky continues sharing intelligence with his contact, Janet Chisholm, unaware of the intense surveillance on him by the Soviet Secret Service. Was he exposed by a Soviet spy who infiltrated Western intelligence agencies? There are numerous hypotheses, but no one knows for certain. In January 1962, Penkovsky sends a memo alerting his case officers that Janet has been followed. They end their rendezvous in the street, opting for brief, less frequent encounters at public events. But what Penkovsky doesn't realize is that the KGB's target isn't Janet. It's him. The Soviet Secret Service follows him everywhere he goes. They have his apartment under permanent surveillance and even search it when he's out in total secrecy.
How do they go into the apartment and do its security? I heard this from Yuri Nisenko, who was a second chief director of the KGB officer who actually was involved in the case. He defected to the United States. He's now dead, but he told me personally, he says, yeah, we put black medicine on his seat. So what's that? He says, we painted it on his seat. It absorbed in through his clothing, onto his butt, made him sick. And so we had to get him to go to the hospital. So when he's in the hospital, we can get free access into his apartment. When the KGB entered his apartment, they were able to find his camera that had been provided by the CIA. They were able to find the one-time pads that were used by him to encrypt communications to and from the CIA. So they were able to find that kind of tradecraft that only a spy organization would have.
The trap closes around the traitor colonel of the USSR. But despite the risks, Oleg Penkovsky continues his work for the Western intelligence agencies. And he seems to have reached a peak in his frenetic attempt to feed them more information.
You couldn't really restrain him. He did too much. He produced too much. When you think about the fact that he stood inside a study room, inside the library at the military academy, taking 8,000 photographs with this little camera. He was so convinced that he could get away with this. He was so driven to be recognized as the best, and he was going to prove he would be the best. He lost that self-preservation sense until it was far too late.
He said famously in one of his debriefs, he wanted to be the greatest spy in history.
Fortunately, Penkovsky had enough time to share thousands of pages of high-level intelligence with the West. Because, as his treason comes to light, one of the biggest crises of the Cold War is about to erupt in a small country of growing concern to the Western Bloc, Cuba. In 1959, the Caribbean island becomes a thorn in the side of the U.S. when Fidel Castro and Cuban guerrillas deposed the pro-American dictator Batista. The new regime angers Washington by nationalizing American goods. And in 1960, as Castro and Khrushchev become allies, they cut off all diplomatic relations with the U.S. On October 14, 1962, an American reconnaissance airplane takes aerial photos of the island of Cuba. In one of the shots, there appears to be what looks like missile launch sites hidden in the jungle. In total secrecy, the USSR is arming the island with the blessing of Fidel Castro. In the days that follow, U.S. reconnaissance planes capture new photos over Cuba. Along with the launch sites, the Soviets brought several bombers and nearly 40 missiles that have a range of more than 930 miles.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Kennedy has to make a choice. And Curtis LeMay and all of these advisors are telling him to invade. They're saying, look, you have every reason now to invade Cuba. We should invade Cuba before these missiles become active and become true threats to the U.S. Kennedy argued that if we just suddenly invade Cuba, isn't that a lot like Pearl Harbor? How's the world going to look at us? Kennedy is looking for an option, some other way other than direct invasion.
When deliberating between strategies, President Kennedy relies on daily reports by the CIA. Many of them are stamped ironbark, which indicates they are based on intelligence provided by Oleg Penkovsky.
There are now 22 surface-to-air missile sites located in Cuba, 9 of which are believed to be individually operational at the present time. The initial firing can take place any time after an alert. Refire from a single launcher will take approximately 3 to 5 minutes.
The nature of the missiles, their power, their range, their technical specifications. Because of Penkovsky, the American authorities can evaluate the extent of the threat.
It is a direct result of Penkovsky's information that allows the United States to know what the range of these missiles are, which is almost every part of the United States except Seattle. And he also knows how these operational missiles will come to be. In other words, how long it's going to take to make them operational. So it is Penkovsky's information that allows Kennedy to know how much time he has to negotiate the withdrawal of the missiles.
Kennedy knows he has, most estimates are between 3 and 8 days before the first set of missiles is going to be active. Now, down the road, he still had an option. If he tried to quarantine and we couldn't work things out, he could still go forward with the invasion.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
On October 22nd, on live television, Kennedy announces a quarantine on Cuba and a blockade of the island by the U.S. Navy.
Kennedy decides that he has to come up with a way that is face-saving for the Soviets to pull their missiles out. So that's when they come up with the idea of a blockade to stop any more missiles being sent in to Cuba. We knew through imagery that there were more ships on the way, that it wasn't over yet. They still had it coming. So he said, we got to stop the delivery of these ships before they get to Cuba. So that's when the Navy was given the mission to stop them.
The U.S. authorities draw a virtual line in the ocean and forbids any Russian ship to cross it. Violation would be considered an act of war.
President Kennedy's decision to implement a naval quarantine, is what he called it, in effect the naval blockade, is really a fairly unprecedented challenge, both to international law and particularly, given the context of Russian missiles coming into Cuba, basically drawing a line in the sea. The problem, of course, is that once you put it into place, you actually have to honor it. So the likelihood of a Russian vessel approaching that quarantine, that blockade, escalates the risk of war.
The entire world holds its breath. But a diplomatic solution is still possible, mostly thanks to Penkovsky. Because in all of his memos, Colonel Penkovsky is adamant. Khrushchev is bluffing.
Kennedy should be firm. Khrushchev is not going to fire any rockets. He's not ready for any war. I respect and love the United States, and I certainly, in Kennedy's place, would be firm.
Penkovsky's constant message through everything Penkovsky tells the Americans is this notion that Nikita Khrushchev is bluffing, that in almost every single respect, the Soviet Union is basically a paper tiger to a large degree. Now, it's a paper tiger with nuclear missiles, so you can only take that so far, but at its core, it changes the dynamic of Soviet-American relations.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you, and good night.
As Kennedy delivers his famous speech, the spy Oleg Penkovsky is arrested by the KGB in Moscow. The Americans have just lost their greatest ally, but they don't know it yet. 2 days later, on October 24th, at Khrushchev's order, 12 boats turn back. The rest stop in their tracks. The tension reaches a peak. This line drawn around Cuba represents the final border before a thermonuclear war. On October 26th, the Soviet leaders asked to negotiate behind closed doors.
They wanted to set up a back-channel communications with the United States to find out if we could negotiate a way to save face, that we'll pull away, but you've got to give us something. So they activated a KGB resident in Washington, D.C., Alexander Feklisov. And they set up a back channel that they can exchange information without the public knowing about it. And we basically say, we will stop the blockade if you'll pull your missiles out. You're just going to stop your armada, you're going to turn around, you're going to take them back. And then quietly, we'll take our weapons out of Turkey.
Secret negotiations keep on for several days. But during this time, the confrontation continues, and each side holds its position. Everyone is on alert, ready to act at the slightest aggression. Finally, on October 28th, the USSR withdraws its ships and promises to dismantle all facilities in Cuba. In exchange, the Americans agree not to attack the island And secretly, Kennedy also promises to dismantle 15 nuclear warhead missiles based in Turkey, Italy, and Great Britain. The crisis is over, and the world takes a breath. Kennedy comes off as the winner. He stayed calm in the face of hostility. On the other hand, Khrushchev is seen as weak, accused by his own side of retreating. But the one truly defeated in this story is without a doubt Oleg Penkovsky. In May 1963, Penkovsky was tried in a tremendous show trial. At the end of the hearing, the spy is sentenced to death and executed on May 16, 1963. This brilliant Soviet officer gave his life for a cause he defended. In just 18 months, he rattled powerful USSR and radically changed the balance of power between the East and the West. Experts are unanimous. Oleg Penkovsky played a crucial role in resolving the most dire crisis of the Cold War.
What Penkovsky did was allow the Americans at the most critical moment in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis, to have an understanding they previously didn't have. So what that means is that you're not far off if you say Penkovsky helped avoid a thermonuclear war.
He paid the ultimate price. But the ambitious Colonel Oleg Penkovsky achieved his goal, becoming one of the greatest spies in history. The one who helped save the world from nuclear war.
This guy was at the right place at the right time and had the right motivation to give us lots of very important information, actually in a very short period of time. Having taught espionage my whole professional life, I know of no human source who is more important than Oleg Penkovsky.
He has to be considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest spy of all time, for all that he contributed.
Arlington Hall, the home of the future National Security Agency. After the end of World War II, these men and women have a special mission: to decipher the coded messages sent by one of their wartime allies, the Soviet Union.
Of course, the United States and the Soviet Union are allies, but there's a great deal of mistrust on both sides. The United States government knew that the Soviet Union was spying on the United States. The FBI had begun several investigations during World War II of Soviet espionage in America. So the relationship was, on the surface friendly, but there was a very strong layer of suspicion right below it.
The task is enormous. Agents intercept thousands of undecipherable telegrams that pass between Moscow and the Soviet embassies or consulates on American soil. But in 1946, thanks to a new, brilliant cryptanalyst named Meredith Gardner, the team manages to crack a crucial message that dates back to December 2nd, 1944. The text cites 24 names, names that no one would imagine appearing in Soviet documents.
What was significant about this list of names is they were probably the most secret names in the world at that time, because all the names were nuclear physicists who were engaged in the Manhattan Project.
The Manhattan Project, supposedly the United States' best-kept secret, the program to build the first nuclear bomb. In Arlington Hall, the discovery hits the team like a shockwave. How could the Russians have known about this top-secret program 8 months before the US dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima? After decrypting this telegram, American counterintelligence services launch a large-scale investigation to discover how deeply the Manhattan Project has been compromised. And most of all, to flush out the moles who did it. May 8th, 1945, the end of the Second World War left Europe exhausted and traumatized after 6 years of conflict. In July 1945, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union meet in Potsdam to decide the fate of the defeated nations. Churchill, Truman, and Stalin appear to stand together to rebuild Europe. But behind closed doors, the seeds of discord have already begun to sprout.
In global strategic terms, the principal concern about the Soviet Union was that the Soviets clearly had ambitions not only to extend their sphere of influence from Central and Eastern Europe, but they had global ambitions.
At an impasse, they divide the world into two parts: the Soviet bloc, controlled by the USSR, and the Western bloc, led by the United States. Between them, an impossible Iron Curtain.
I think the Potsdam Conference was the first major manifestation of the Cold War.
In this delicate and contentious new arrangement, the Americans, for the moment, are one step ahead. Just a few years earlier, in 1938, the world learned that a German physicist had discovered nuclear fission and its tremendous potential for producing an ultra-powerful bomb. Several countries launched atomic bomb research programs, but none approached the scale of the American one. Codename, the Manhattan Project.
The Manhattan Project is the project where the goal is not to do research on can you make an atomic bomb, how would you do it? No, the goal is to make atomic bombs. And that requires hundreds of thousands of people, billions of dollars, creating essentially an entirely new industry from scratch.
More than 30 sites across the USA and Canada join this colossal endeavor. Among them, Oak Ridge on the banks of the Tennessee River, dedicated to obtaining uranium-235. Hanford, Washington State, assigned to produce plutonium-239. Developing and building the sensitive bomb mechanism happens in a once sleepy town called Los Alamos.
It was very isolated. But once the government came and decided this is where they wanted to have their top secret scientific research laboratory, it did not appear on any maps. Suddenly it was not allowed to speak the word Los Alamos. It didn't exist. There were military police on horseback who would patrol the perimeter. There were many restrictions.
The Soviets have a different kind of nuclear program. They don't invest heavily in research, but they excel at espionage. Germany, France, the UK, Canada, India, Argentina. During the Second World War, the USSR set up the largest spy network in the world, men and women on the payroll of the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB, infiltrate the highest posts in Western countries.
The communist ideology, the socialist ideology, had a particular attractiveness to a wide number of people in the United States. And the Soviet intelligence service was very adept at exploiting that and finding people that then subsequently were in mid-level and senior positions in government and in the various elements of the American war industry during the war.
The ideological recruitment of Americans is an interesting phenomenon. Of course, you had the Great Depression. There were many reasons. People that were disaffected after World War I, and Western society in and of itself had bred people who saw society and capitalism as having failed, and Moscow as offering another answer, and maybe a better answer. That was the fertile ground with which the Soviets operated.
There was a belief, a false belief as we now know, that the Soviet Union was a workers' paradise.
They believe that the United States is this imperial power that wants to take over the world. So for them, putting the United States in check, that might lead to a better world.
The American nuclear program isn't immune to espionage. Spies infiltrate every research site, including Los Alamos. Despite the drastic security measures, the best-kept secret in the United States is no secret at all. This is Klaus Fuchs. The tennis ball is a secret signal. Born in Germany, son of an anti-Nazi communist pastor, he fled at the beginning of the war and pursued an education in physics in England.
While he's in the UK, he ends up meeting people who are involved with the Russian Army Intelligence, the GRU. And they basically, over some time, get him to agree to give them copies of his work. And some of this is again, even before he's involved in the atomic bomb work. It's kind of a coincidence that he gets pulled in on that. Once he gets pulled in on that, they get very excited by this. He continues to work on it. He is very good at his job. He's one of the most brilliant people working on the project.
In 1943, a group of British scientists comes to the United States to participate in the Manhattan Project, and Klaus Fuchs is among them. The Americans are not the only ones to benefit from his research.
He comes to Great Britain. Great Britain hosts him, gives him shelter from the Nazis, effectively. What does he do? He starts spying on the British. Then he takes that espionage activity and moves it to North America and starts spying on the Americans.
The spies during the war are not always seeing it as the United States versus the Soviet Union. I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union are allies. Fuchs is seeing it more like Fuchs is helping fight the Nazis on two fronts.
In February 1944, the man with the green book meeting Fuchs is a Soviet agent named Harry Gold.
Harry Gold is a Swiss-born chemist, and he has been engaged in industrial espionage for a long period of time for the Soviets, stealing processes, stealing intellectual property, systems, chemical processes. Harry Gold's sole function in relation to Klaus Fuchs is to act as a courier, an intermediary, a go-between. Klaus Fuchs is supplying information that is collected by Harry Gold. He doesn't know Harry Gold's true identity. Harry Gold then passes it on to a recipient who passes it on to the NKVD. So it's a cutout, if you like.
Between February and June 1944, Klaus Fuchs drafts dozens of notes about his work. Top secret information directly related to the bomb design, which he shares with Harry Gold. The original documents, provided by the young physicist, are still classified as top secret. But his spy work is confirmed by this Soviet telegram dated July 25, 1944. It appears under its code name, Rest.
Almost half a year of contact with Rest has demonstrated the value of his work for us. We consider it necessary to pay him for this half year the due reward of $500. He fully deserves this sum.
The Soviet intelligence agency does not hide its interest in Fuchs. Then suddenly, during the summer of '44, their recruit receives an unexpected promotion. Fuchs leaves New York to join the theoretical division at the Los Alamos Research Center.
He's not some small character. He's put in charge of some of the hardest problems relating to the implosion weapon, so the crushing of the plutonium, because he's very, very good at these kinds of things. He's also put on problems relating to how to calculate how explosive your bomb is. I mean, some of the original calculations and papers that are foundational to making the atomic bomb have his name as an author, so he's not minor in any way.
Klaus Fuchs occupies a strategic spot in Los Alamos research, and he is one of the few scientists to benefit from a global perspective of the project.
Most people on the Manhattan Project knew almost nothing about what was going on. And there was sort of one exception to that, and that is the colloquium series at Los Alamos. These were meetings that would be held by people who had the highest security. They would have many of these meetings, and Fuchs was allowed to go to all of them. With these meetings, he knows about huge amounts of work going on, problems they're having in parts of the bomb that he's not involved with. These help him a lot in sort of getting a big picture. You really can't imagine, if what you're trying to learn is how to make an atomic bomb, there's really no better spy that you would ever get than Klaus Fuchs. He knew everything. He practically had a photographic memory. He was involved with everything, and nobody suspected him.
The spy, Klaus Fuchs, is invaluable to the USSR intelligence services. But in Los Alamos, he's not the only one keeping secrets.
Darling, I have been reading a lot of books on the Soviet Union. Dear, I can see how farsighted and intelligent those leaders are. I've come to a stronger belief in the principles of socialism and communism.
These words were written by 22 years old David Greenglass in a letter sent to his wife in June 1944. He's a mechanical engineer and is preparing to join the engineering department at the Los Alamos labs. A longtime communist sympathizer, he is recruited as a spy by members of his own family.
David Greenglass had a sister. She was married to a man named Julius Rosenberg.
Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. The couple has been a part of the New York network of Soviet agents for a long time. One of their missions is to recruit new spies. So when they find out that David is joining the Manhattan Project, they deem him an ideal candidate. In the autumn of '44, when David Greenglass is already in Los Alamos, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg invite his wife to dinner. Their goal, to persuade her to convince her husband to collaborate with the enemy. Several weeks later, this telegram is sent to Moscow. Enclosed is David Greenglass's decision. It appears under the codename Caliber, and his wife is renamed Osa.
Osa has returned from a trip to see Caliber. Caliber expressed his readiness to help in throwing light on the work being carried on at Camp 2.
Camp 2. It's the Soviet code name for Los Alamos. On December 16, 1944, Greenglass becomes an undercover spy in the thick of the Manhattan Project. He doesn't have the same expertise as Klaus Fuchs and has less access to technical information.
Caliber has arrived in Tyre on leave. He has given us a handwritten plan of the layout of Camp 2 and facts known to him about the work and the personnel. The basic task of the camp is to make the mechanism, which is to serve as the detonator.
This NKVD telegram gives a glimpse of what the young spy was sending. A map of Los Alamos, but also details about the work in progress. The classified information begins to flow. Out of sight, Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass draft detailed reports on their work, filling pages and pages with mathematical formulas, copying the plans of various bomb parts, and smuggling out these ultra-sensitive documents. On June 2, 1945, Klaus Fuchs meets in Santa Fe with Harry Gold, his liaison officer. On this day, he provides one of the most crucial documents, a detailed plan of the plutonium bomb, including its dimensions. It also reveals that the first US tests are scheduled for as early as July. The following day, Harry Gold rings at a door in Albuquerque, not far from Santa Fe. He has a meeting with David Greenglass while visiting his wife nearby. Documents provided by Greenglass confirm that Fuchs is one of the main suppliers of top-secret information to the Soviets.
There is no doubt that the information that the Soviets received from Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass was absolutely essential to avoid all the rabbit holes, all the dead ends, all the red herrings. They'd saved thousands of hours and millions of dollars not having to pursue the full research program. So they had all the benefit of the spies within the Manhattan Project.
The question is, why do people spy, and why do they take the decision to spy, and what does that mean for them? If somebody decides to betray their country, of course, that's a significant event. People that decide to do these things, many cases, they have significant egos. Either they believe themselves above risk, or they have some special role in the world, and this is going to be a chance to make their mark.
As details of the American project gradually pass into the hands of the NKVD in July of 1945, 250 scientists and technicians find themselves in the middle of the desert, organizing the very first atomic bomb tests. On July 16, 1945, at 5:30 in the morning, a powerful explosion equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT resounds. The atomic mushroom is visible within a radius of 300 kilometers. Shortly after, the United States sends Japan an ultimatum to surrender. But on July 28th, the Japanese government rejects the proposition. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb Little Boy strikes Hiroshima. 70,000 people are killed instantly. Just as many are injured. 3 days later, the US launches a second bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. This time, 40,000 deaths. With its back against the wall, Japan surrenders on September 2nd, 1945. For now, the United States has sole possession of this new and inconceivably powerful weapon. It assures the Americans of their dominance. But what they are about to discover will shake everything they know. In 1946, just a few months after the war, the men and women of Arlington Hall worked tirelessly to try to crack the Russian telegrams. The Russian secret services use a highly effective encryption method, the one-time pad. First, it's a question of converting the letters of the message into a series of numbers based on a straddling checkerboard memorized by the agent. The numbers are then gathered into groups of 5. Then, a one-time pad containing random numbers is added. Only the sender and the receiver of the message have these matching pads. The numbers of the same column are added 2 by 2. Then the 10th digits are erased. Here's the message as sent. To decode it, the recipient will use the same straddling checkerboard, and most importantly, the same one-time pad to reverse the operation.
Even the most powerful supercomputer in the world cannot break a one-time pad message if it's done correctly with the 5 important steps. A random number. Only 2 copies, one with the sender, one with the receiver. Destroyed immediately after it's used. The user adds, the receiver subtracts. And the 5th, the length of the key needs to be equal at least to the length of the message. And with those 5 conditions in place, you have an unbreakable message.
For months, the cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall struggle with these impressive disposable pads. But in early 1946, a new recruit joins the Russian project team. His name, Meredith Gardner. This brilliant linguist manages to unearth the elusive flaw. Duplicates in the single-use code sheets. Extremely small series of perfectly identical numbers found in several telegrams.
Once the Soviet Union was in World War II, the intelligence traffic ramped up enormously. They're sending enormous numbers of messages, and thus using enormous numbers of one-time pads. This is the pre-computer age. today, if you want to generate random numbers, a computer can do it, and it can generate random numbers from now until the end of time. It was a lot harder and a lot more time-consuming to generate random numbers during World War II. And they couldn't manufacture enough. So they decided, let's use some of the one-time pads twice. How likely is it that anybody will ever find out? So they began to reproduce one-time pad pages and slip them into new one-time pads.
Exploiting these minuscule repetitions, Gardner cracks the Soviet intelligence exchanges and learns that the top-secret Manhattan Project has been compromised down to the names of project scientists.
Now, the interesting point is that the scientists who had been employed in the Manhattan Project worked there at Los Alamos under alias. So although some of them were very well-known Nobel Prize winners, even they operated under alias.
American intelligence people are stunned. Here's a Russian cable naming the American scientists that are working on the atomic bomb, names that were not publicly known. So this was really the first major realization on the part of American intelligence that the Soviet espionage had penetrated the atomic bomb project.
The cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall work relentlessly to flush out the Soviet spies. But decoding new telegrams takes time. Meanwhile, in the USSR, the nuclear research program has grown in total secrecy. Starting in 1945, the ranks swell to nearly 600,000 employees and scientists. And on August 29th, 1949, in Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union orders its first nuclear test. The USSR becomes the second country with the atomic bomb.
The atomic bomb that the Soviets detonated in August 1949 was probably an exact replica of the Fat Man bomb that the United States dropped on Nagasaki. From everything we know, the Soviets did not deviate from the plans that they received courtesy of espionage of the American and British work at Los Alamos. The information gave the Soviets a clear leg up.
Realizing the extent of the security breach, the Americans ramp up their efforts to decipher Soviet telegrams, renaming it the Venona Project. Gradually, they decode more messages, plunging the American intelligence services into absolute and utter horror. The original documents are still top secret, stashed in the secure archives of the NSA. But in recent years, copies of the translations by Meredith Gardner and his colleagues have been declassified. Among these thousands of pages is this telegram involving text that dates back to February 1944.
On the 5th of February, a meeting took place between Gus and Rest. Liberal, referring to his ignorance of the problem, expresses the wish that our man should meet Caliber and interrogate him personally.
Gus, Rest, Liberal, Caliber, Arno, Charles. Code names found in the deciphered Venona papers. All of them associated with what the Soviets call the Enormous Project, aka the Manhattan Project.
If we talk about the impact of the No-No, it was certainly monumental on American counterintelligence and American national security. Before that, of course, many people had denied or did not want to see that the Soviet Union was not a faithful ally, that during the war they had used that time to target the United States.
A network of Soviet spies has uncovered the United States' deepest military secret. U.S. intelligence starts a relentless hunt to flush out the men hiding behind these pseudonyms. FBI Special Agent Robert Lamphere leads the investigation. He sifts through the decoded telegrams, looking for the smallest clue.
It became clear that there was one particular source whose code names were first of all Charles and then Rest, R-E-S-T. Bob Lamphere was able to identify one particular text which indicated that Charles had traveled over Christmas 1944 to New Haven, Connecticut, and by going back to Los Alamos and checking the furlough records and to see who had been given leave over that particular period, it was possible to narrow down the number of suspects to 3 individuals. And then ultimately it was discovered that Klaus Fuchs had a sister living in New Haven, Connecticut. And on that basis, the evidence pointed to Klaus Fuchs, and he became the focus of the investigation.
Meanwhile, Klaus Fuchs has returned to England to work on the British atomic project. So the Crown Secret Service questions him first.
The problem for the British and American investigators was to extract some kind of evidence from him that would incriminate him, but that would not compromise the source of the information, because the decryption program was still running and there was still contemporaneous traffic that was being intercepted and being read, albeit retrospectively. So the key was to extract information from Fuchs, and this was done in a very casual interrogation that was conducted by MI5 in a pub. Over a period of 3 long lunches with his interrogator, Klaus Fuchs started to compromise himself.
The spy, Klaus Fuchs, is arrested and imprisoned. During his interrogations, British and American intelligence services discover the shocking extent of his collaboration with the enemy.
In his confession to the British, and a follow-up confession to the FBI as well, Fuchs tells them that he gave the Soviet Union information on pretty much everything to do with the design of the bomb. He gave them all the dimensions, he told them how it was laid out. So we're talking about what's the size of the plutonium at the core, what surrounds that, how do the explosives work, what is the principle, what is the math. This guy gave everything he remembered, and he remembered many things.
He was an ideological man in the guise of being your sort of mild-mannered scientist, but in fact he was primarily driven by ideology. When he's nice to people at Los Alamos, he was always thinking, these are all nice people, I want to work with them and all the rest, but they really don't recognize that the future of the world lies somewhere else. And that's probably how he justified it to himself.
Klaus Fuchs articulated the view that the information that he had been entrusted with in the Second World War was of universal nature and should not just have been the monopoly of the American government.
The first link in the chain of atomic spies has broken, and thanks to Fuchs, the hunt for other members proceeds. The next suspect on the list is someone called Gus, or Arno. The Soviets refer to him as Klaus Fuchs' liaison officer. During interrogation, Fuchs formally identifies the New Yorker Harry Gold in a photo. Arrested in May of 1950, Harry Gold confesses quickly, and the dominoes fall one by one.
In order to save his neck, he compromised the other person that he had serviced as a courier, who was, of course, David Greenglass. And when David Greenglass was interviewed, in order to save his neck, he had a choice of really compromising either his wife, Ruth, or his sister, Ethel. And he identified as a Soviet spy his own sister, Ethel Rosenberg. And that, of course, drew the attention to her husband, Julius.
The Rosenberg trial at the end of 1950 became one of the most famous U.S. trials of the 20th century. The telegrams decrypted under the Venona Project attest to their guilt. But at no time are the documents presented to the court.
The Venona material was never mentioned in any court proceeding during this era. The United States government did not want to reveal that it had partially broken into these Soviet codes. There's an irony here, because within a very short time after the Venona breakthroughs had been achieved, the Soviets knew we had done it, because they had a spy within the Venona project.
So the prosecution of the Rosenbergs was based really on evidence that was supplied by witnesses, including, of course, David Greenglass, and the evidence was overwhelming.
Despite the proof, the Rosenbergs refused to cooperate or confess to espionage. Faced with a couple's... By far, the Rosenbergs, who became public face of the fight against communist traitors, pay the highest price in the Soviet spy hunt. While they received the death penalty, Klaus Fuchs is sentenced to 14 years in prison in the UK. David Greenglass is sentenced to 15 years. And Harry Gold, 30. But they only represent a fraction of the vast spy networks woven by the Soviet Union around the Manhattan Project. As the months go by, other code names appear in the decrypted telegrams. Star, Calistrat, Malad, Quantum, more looters of classified information. But who are they? How to crack their secret identities? In 1951, as the Rosenbergs are tried, the cryptologist Meredith Gardner decodes the most explicit telegram yet, sent from New York to Moscow 7 years earlier.
Beck visited Theodore Hall, 19 years old, the son of a furrier. He is a graduate of Harvard University. As a talented physicist, he was taken on for government work. According to Beck's account, Hall has an exceptionally keen mind and a broad outlook, and is politically developed. At the present time, Hall is in charge of a group at Camp 2. H handed over to Beck a report about the camp and named the personnel employed on enormous. He decided to do this on the advice of his colleague, Saville Sachs, a gymnast living in Tyre.
It's a big break for the FBI. They identify Theodore Hall, a young Harvard physicist, still working at Los Alamos, and presumably still spying. And also Saville Sachs, one of his friends. Codenames Star and Malad.
Ted Hall is a very interesting example of a very young spy with a political commitment. And he used Savile Sachs as a courier. It is clear from the Venona traffic that he was cooperating with the NKVD and passed a lot of information to them and was highly regarded.
With Hall, it's also a case of ego. I mean, Hall is the youngest member of the Manhattan Project, and it's clear that he feels like he's pretty smart and he's getting to be with all these Nobel Prize winners and do this cool work, but he also worked for the Soviet Union. If you're 19, that sounds very exciting. So he's changing the world just by talking.
After identifying the two men, the FBI faces a problem. How to approach them without divulging the existence of the Venona project.
After a long period of investigation and surveillance, both are picked up on the same day and then interrogated separately and confronted with the allegation that both of them have acted as Soviet spies. Each not realizing that the other has been arrested goes to considerable lengths to protest their innocence and not to implicate the others.
They figure it out, but they're unable to get a clean case against Ted Hall. And as a result, he never goes to prison. He dies a free man because they could not find a way to prosecute him without making it clear that Venona sources were involved.
Not until the declassification of the Venona project telegrams in 1995 does anyone outside the NSA or the FBI know about Theodore Hall and his liaison officer.
The irony is that all of the secrecy provisions that scientists at Los Alamos had to endure, was it all in vain? I mean, it was certainly compromised to a great extent by the actions of these individuals.
Some experts believe that Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, Ted Hall, and the other atomic spies rebalanced the world powers. Others insist they tipped the planet closer to Armageddon. Either way, there is no going back.
When you judge Operation Enormous, I think that you can say that this is an extraordinary manifestation of espionage being conducted at its highest level. This provided the Soviets with an atomic weapon in August 1949, which dramatically changed history. So it's hard to exaggerate the influence, the impact of these spies.
The Manhattan Project had been referred at the end of the war as the best kept secret of the war. And then you find out that it's full of spies who were everywhere in it. So that's one of a couple things that happens about 1949, early 1950 that really makes it seem impossible to imagine a world in which the United States and the Soviet Union are going to somehow get along in some easy way, and everybody just starts making as many weapons as they can. So it's very profound.
The infiltration of the Manhattan Project and the theft of the atomic bomb plans escalated the tension between the two superpowers. Suddenly, it was not about how to win the war, but how to avoid nuclear war. In the 21st century, the scope of this amazing spy affair on both sides of the Iron Curtain is finally exposed, revealing a story that remained top secret for so long and which transformed the face of the world.